Hey everyone, welcome to our first video in our Christianity 101 series where we're going to ask the question, is there any really good evidence for God's existence? Right here on Apologetics Underground. So in the 1870s in Germany, there's this guy, and his name is Friedrich Nietzsche. You probably heard of him before. He's pretty famous even today still. He's known for a lot of things, primarily being a philosopher, cultural critic, and a proponent of what is famously known as nihilism, the belief that nothing exists except reality. And that's a little simplistic, but that's basically the bare bones of it. But what most people who believe in God, or claim to anyway, know Nietzsche for saying is that God is dead. But you know what? That's not really what he said, and certainly not entirely how he meant it to be taken. You see, most people think that Nietzsche says God is dead with gusto and a lot of joy and happiness, like it's a celebration. Woohoo! God is dead, but that's not really how he meant it. You see, God being dead to Nietzsche meant, well, a lot of bad things, actually. He looked at his European culture around him and saw that most of their morality came from the belief in God. And he realized, as a nihilist, that if there is no God and we remove God from our culture, a lot of that morality is going to go with it. Now, you would think this would cause him maybe to double down on the existence of God, but that's not the route he took. Instead, he decided to try and find another basis for morality. It doesn't sound like Nietzsche was a guy that was kind of on our side as Christians. But you know what a lot of Christians don't say? Kind of a secret, really. Nietzsche was a pretty smart guy. And I mean, man, what a great writer, and worth reading in a lot of ways. Because I think we need to understand exactly where this idea of Nietzsche saying God is dead really comes from. And really what it comes from is his very famous parable of the madman. In Nietzsche's parable of the madman, he imagines this crazy guy with a lantern wandering the streets, looking at all the people who are standing around, going about their own business, and he's asking a very important question. He writes, "The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. 'Whither is God?' he cried. 'I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of us all, that the world has yet owned, has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off of us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods to simply appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us, for the sake of this deed, he will belong to a higher history than all history hitherto." I told you the guy can write. But did you get what he was trying to say in that story? Here's this madman, and he's asking, where is God? Where is God? And when no one can answer the question, he gives them the answer. God is dead. We've killed him. But notice what he said that will result in. He says that it would wipe away the horizon, that it would be as if the sun went out or we were cast out on the earth, hurtling into an infinite space that has no meaning in it. You see, again, Nietzsche understood that if you take God out of the culture, the things associated with God will go with it. And for him, he knew that meant morality. He knew that meant some sort of ethical code that we had built all on the idea of God is watching. But you have to remember that Nietzsche thought that it's a good thing God is gone in a way, because now we have to replace him. Now we have to stand up. What he says here is, do we not have to become gods ourselves? You see, Nietzsche was probably an atheist. We're not certain, but really hear what he's saying in that. It's hard to think he's not one. And even if he isn't, which we're not sure, even if he isn't, his work certainly has been used by more modern atheists, guys like John Paul Sartre, Bertrand Russell, and even real modern guys like Richard Dawkins and his ilk. You see, they look at this statement, God is dead, and they say, well, he was never here to begin with. We don't need God because we don't need fantasy. And they start saying things like, well, how could anybody believe in God anyway? There's no evidence for it, right? We already mentioned him, but Bertrand Russell was kind of the poster boy of atheism during his time in the 20th century. And he was asked once by an interviewer that if he were to die and meet God, what would be the first thing that he asked of him? His response was this: why didn't you give more evidence for yourself? In the 21st century, Richard Dawkins, kind of the Bertrand Russell of now, he was asked this same question. And he formulated his response a little differently, but still kind of saying the same thing. He said he would ask God, "Sir, why did you go to such great lengths to hide yourself?" You see, to listen to these guys, it would seem to be that there is no evidence to believe in God. There's no good reason to believe in God. And to listen to Nietzsche, he would say, well, we don't need God. We got rid of him. Instead of just putting him back on the throne, let's put something else in its place and build upon that. But if that's the case, if we don't need God, and there's no really good evidence for God being around in the first place, why do so many people still believe in him? Okay, imagine the following scenario. You're at work, and you're at the water cooler, and you're talking with your buddy, and it comes up that you went to church last Sunday. And then that one guy at work, you know that one guy, right? He hears you say it, and he comes up and says, "You go to church?" And you say, "Yeah." And he says, "You really believe in God?" And you say, a little more sheepishly, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, how can you believe in God? What evidence do you have?" Now, you might not have found yourself in this particular scenario, but a lot of people have found themselves in one like it. And I get it. It's a daunting idea. Here I am, put on the spot, and I have to give a reason why I believe in a creator of the universe. It seems like such a big concept. Too big, really. You know what most people do in that scenario? They say, well, I just do, or my beliefs are my belief. And they try to escape. I call that pulling the cord. But you don't have to pull the cord. You can engage. You don't believe me? Well, what if I told you that there are plenty of good reasons to believe in God? Here, let's start with just 3. There are a lot more than 3, but let's just start with 3. If I could give you 3, maybe you could think about them. Here's the first one. See, there's this other guy, William Lane Craig, and he's a Christian philosopher and is very, very well known in Christianity for coming up with this, or putting forward, I should say, this argument called the Cosmological argument for the existence of God. And it's real simple. It's only got 3 parts to it. 2 premises and a conclusion. And it says this: everything that begins to exist has a cause. Number 2, the universe began to exist. Number 3, therefore, the universe has a cause. Nothing in there too scary, right? I mean, seems pretty benign. Well, let's break it down, because you might be wondering, how does that equal God? Well, consider this. Number 1, let's talk about that first one. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. I mean, that's been your experience, right? Things don't just randomly pop into existence. If you're sitting at your table reading the newspaper, you don't expect a ham sandwich to just appear on a plate, perfectly made in front of you for no reason. If there's a ham sandwich there, it's because somebody made that ham sandwich. Somebody put all those things together to make that ham sandwich and put it on a plate and set it in front of you. And all the constituent parts of that ham sandwich, including even the plate, all of those have beginnings and reasons for their existence. That's what we expect. That's been our experience every day. In fact, if we could expect things to start randomly popping into existence, well, you probably wouldn't leave your house every morning for work. I mean, who's to say a unicorn doesn't appear at the end of your driveway for no reason, right? So that first one, that's easy. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. I don't know anyone that doesn't believe that. Number 2, the universe has a beginning. Now, this doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, really. Does it? It doesn't to me. I mean, pretty much everybody believes, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, that the universe began to exist. But you know what? That wasn't always the case. For a long, long, long time, atheists used to say that the universe is eternal, meaning it's always been here. There was never a time in which the universe wasn't. But then we started studying the universe, and we discovered that, well, that's just not the case. I don't know how you feel about the Big Bang. And no, not the TV show, but the Big Bang Theory, the real one. I don't know how you feel about it, but you have to at least admit, whether you think it's great or awful, that it does pretty much prove that there was a moment in which the universe wasn't. And if that's the case, in order for the universe to be here now, just like that ham sandwich sitting in front of you on the kitchen table, it would have to have a beginning, a reason for being there. Okay, well, that's the first 2. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Let's get to that third one, the conclusion. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Again, doesn't seem too scary, right? Too hard to believe. If the universe began to exist, and everything that does begin to exist has a cause, then the universe has a cause. You're like, I don't see how that equals God. I mean, that cause could be anything, right? Well, not really. Because you have to remember what we're talking about when we talk about the universe. We're talking about everything. We're talking about all of time and space. Go ahead. Try to think of something that doesn't exist that you know of in time and space. So those causes could not come from within time and space. That cause would have to come from beyond time and space. And not only that, in order to create all of this, I mean, look around you. All of this, that cause would have to be amazingly, incredibly, infinitely powerful. But you know what? That's a lot of adjectives. Why don't we just call it all-powerful? And you know what else it would have to be? It would have to be personal. Now, before you freak out on me, just hear me out. Because I can already hear the wheels spinning. Okay, here comes the pitch. Here's where you put God in. You shoehorn God in there to get to this Jesus talk, right? But just hold up on that. Because think about it. What causes things other than persons? You see, there could be something that exists beyond the universe, time and space, and may or may not be all-powerful if it exists, really can think of only two things. Abstract objects like numbers, sets, things like that, which some people do believe really exist, or a person. But there's a problem with that first one. Since when does the number 7 do anything? So by process of elimination, guess what we're back to? That person. So here's what we're looking at. A cause that is beyond time and space, eternal, that is infinitely, awesomely, amazingly powerful, all-powerful, and is a personal force. Sure sounds like God to me. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that universe, shall we? You know, the one we live in. If you start to think about it and really look at it, what's going on around us, you start to realize that everything around us has been finely tuned to a very specific degree. You know, we hear scientists talk about this sometimes, you know, astrophysicists and, you know, the guys that look up. And they talk about how planets typically have to be for them to have life on them, have to be in what's called the Goldilocks zone. You know, that's that distance from its orbiting star that's not too hot and not too cold. You know, the Earth happens to be there. And then you also probably remember from school that the Earth is at a particular axis. It's spinning on an axis at a particular set of degrees. And it's also spinning at a particular speed. And it's going around the sun in a very, very carefully dictated orbit. But what if I told you those are the little things? There are some numbers and some degrees and some math here that's even more insurmountable than that. Take this one, for example, the atomic weak force. You might not have heard of that, and I don't even fully understand it myself because, well, I'm not an astrophysicist. But the atomic weak force is basically a law that allows fusion to take place. You've heard of fusion, right? It's what stars do. Our sun's a star. We kind of need that. Okay. Scientists have discovered that, and you can look this up for yourself, but scientists have discovered that in order for the atomic weak force to function, which would allow fusion, which allows life, okay, it has to be finely tuned down to 1 in 10 to the 100th power. Let me explain that number just a minute for just a minute for those of you who might not be following me. 10 to the 100th power. That's a 1 with 100 zeros after it. 100. 1 in that. Try thinking about that number for a minute. Pretty big, right? But that's not even the biggest. Not even close, really. There's another one about the expansion rate of the universe. You see, the universe is expanding, it's growing, and it's doing so at a particular speed. And in order for life to exist, that speed has to be set. It has to be expanding at a certain rate. And that rate has been finely tuned down to 1 in 10 to the 120th power. Again, that's a 1 with 120 zeros after it. That's a huge number. And there are even more than that. You can look them up for yourselves, but just those two alone are enough to let us know that this universe, in order for us to live in it and exist in it, has to have been finely tuned down to a razor's edge, or there's no life at all. Okay, we get it. The universe is finely tuned. But how? Not so much why. I think we get why, because all of these things have to function and work in order for us to be alive. That's why. I think a far better question is how. How did they get that finely tuned? Well, maybe you're thinking of some possible answers. Maybe some of you are thinking, well, maybe it's that way because it has to be. It has to be that way. The laws of nature dictate that it has to be finely tuned like this. This is a way of saying it's finely tuned by necessity. And a lot of people go this route. They think that maybe there's a theory out there, a so-called theory of everything, that will explain how the universe is the way it is. Okay? But there's a problem with that. You see, in order for the laws to dictate how the laws are so finely tuned, well, how can they do that? How can they dictate to themselves in their own system? Seems to me that whatever caused the universe to be this finely tuned to such a degree, it would have to be outside of those laws, external to them. They can't do it themselves. Think of it this way. You ever had to tune up your engine? You know, dial it in just right because maybe it was firing a little bit out of sequence? You took it to a mechanic, right? You didn't just expect your engine to do that itself, did you? Okay. Maybe you're thinking, okay, if it's not necessity, if it doesn't just have to be that way, chance. Maybe chance. Maybe it just happened. You know, we rolled the dice and this is what we came up with. Think about those numbers we talked about a minute ago. 10 to the 100th power. 1 in 10 to the 100th power. 1 with 100 zeros. 1 in 10 to the 120th power. 1 with 120 zeros. How many times do you think you'd have to roll the dice to get that number? And how many times? I mean, that's just 2 examples. There are way more than 2. Some people try to say, well, maybe a multiverse then. Okay. Now, imagine the multiverse is this. Maybe there are a bunch of different universes out there. Maybe we're not the only one. And they all exist kind of next to each other, kind of like bubbles in a big ball of soap in the top of your dishwasher. And each bubble is a universe. And maybe in some, they're not finely tuned. And there are just enough universes to get us down to this one in which it worked. Well, that doesn't solve the problem. In fact, it just makes it way, way more complicated. I mean, think about all the numbers that will be associated with the multiverse if just one universe has numbers like this in it. Okay, so if necessity's out and chance is out, well, how about design? That one's interesting. I want you to imagine for a second that you're walking in the woods with your friend and you look down in the dirt path and you see a pocket watch sitting there, ticking away, tick, 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 keeping the time at a rhythm. And you look at the pocket watch and you say to your friend, how did this watch get here? And your friend says, well, obviously somebody dropped it. And you say, no, how did this watch come to be? And your friend says, well, maybe it just has to be. And you say, no, that doesn't seem to make any sense. And then your friend says, well, maybe all of the pieces of this watch, in order to make it exist and tick the way it does, maybe they just fell together by accident, by chance. No, that doesn't seem right either, does it? But then your friend says, well, maybe somebody made it. Maybe a designer put that watch together in just the right way. Obviously, it makes sense if we're talking about a watch, because it's a watch, right? But you know what's interesting? The logic of that process stays the same no matter how big or finely tuned the watch is. If it's a pocket watch, it works, but it also works if it's not a pocket watch. It also works if it's the universe that we're talking about, because it's even more finely tuned than that. So design. But again, what does design require? A designer. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of different things. We've talked about, where everything comes from, and all these numbers associated with how finely tuned the universe is. And I understand that those are good arguments, but they're a little cold. Maybe we should make it a little more personal, a little more down to earth. Because for my money, this is the kicker. Have you ever had a bad day? I mean, have you ever had a day just happen to you and you say, well, this happened and that was bad, and this happened and that was terrible, and my boss was mean to me at work, he was being unfair to me, or my wife is angry at me for no reason, or I'm angry at her for this reason. Look, we've all had days like that. We've all had moments what we associate as bad, but we just use that word willy-nilly. Like, what does it really mean, bad? It kind of raises a question, and it's a question that seems simplistic and kind of goofy on the surface, but I think it's a good one, and it's this. Do fish know they're wet? I mean, think about it. If you're a fish and you've lived your entire life underwater and you've never been above the surface, do you know you're wet? Of course you don't. Why? Because you don't have anything to compare it to. All you've known is wetness, and therefore you don't really know what wetness means. Darkness and light are the same. If you've never seen before, if you were born without eyes, well, you have no real appreciation for what light is. These are all comparisons that we make and just commonly in our language. It's definitely a comparison we make when we use the word bad. I had a bad day. Well, as opposed to what? Well, a good day. Well, what's a good day? Well, if this had happened, if that had happened, that would have been good. But see, it goes beyond just saying my day was bad or my day was good. We use these comparative judgments to refer to things that happen in our world. The president is good or the president is bad. This movie was good or this movie was bad. We do that all the time, and we even get deeper with that. We say things like good and evil, or right and wrong. Again, these are comparative statements. When I say something is wrong, I am holding it up against a standard that is considered to be right. But we have to ask ourselves this question: where does that standard come from? What creates that standard? I hear a lot of people who claim to not believe in God, who claim there is no God, and they're very positive about the lack of God's existence. And I still hear them say things like, it would be wrong to do this, or this is evil. I don't know too many people who are atheists who are willing to say that Adolf Hitler was a good guy. They all say he was a bad guy. And they all say that what he tried to do with the extermination of the Jewish people was evil. But that confuses me a little bit. Not because I disagree that it was evil. Of course it was evil. But I just don't know how they're getting to that conclusion. It's not the answer they're giving that I find an issue with. It's the work they're doing to get there. Look, assuming for a second that there is no God, what is good? What makes something good if God doesn't exist? You see, from a theist perspective, not a Christian perspective, but a theist perspective, God is the source of goodness. He is the standard setter for what is good and right. We're going to talk more about exactly how that works in a later video, but for right now, assuming that that's the case, that God is the one from whom goodness flows, and He's the one that makes things good, and therefore makes the opposite of those things bad. And if you take Him out, well, you're taking out the standard itself. And with no standard, there's nothing to compare badness to. Therefore, who's to say what's bad? Just like who's to say whether a fish is wet or dry if there is no dry? Now, you might be saying, I've heard a lot of people say in response to what I just said, well, that's just you plugging your God in and saying, well, that your God is the objective moral value. What if it was, Ra or Zeus or Odin or Cthulhu or whoever? You could plug any God's name in there, and that would be what that person who believes in that God would say, that my God is the objective moral value behind morality, behind ethics. Well, that's an interesting point. Too bad it's a bad one. Because I'm not plugging in the Christian God when I say that. I'm plugging in the God. We haven't defined who that God is yet. We're just saying that here are some reasons to say that God must exist. Because if God doesn't exist, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. And if they do exist, well, then we have to explain why they're there. And I think the best explanation for that is God. Now, in part, do you know who kind of agrees with that? Do you remember from the beginning? Nietzsche. Just a little bit. I mean, he won't go the full route that I've just gone, but he does agree that if you take God out of the culture, if you remove God from the minds of the people, if there's no longer this deity above men saying do this and don't do that, then the ethic goes with it when you remove him. Now again, Nietzsche's answer to that was, let's plug something else in to create that standard. But my issue is, what can we plug in? Okay, well, let's try to plug in maybe, I don't know, popular vote. Murder is wrong because we all agree that it's wrong. Okay, I will admit, pretty much everybody agrees that murder is wrong. But what happens when we stop agreeing on that? What happens when we all start to say that murder is right? Or at least this specific instance of murder. And we make that okay in this specific instance. Why are we able to argue against that? And by the way, I don't know if you've caught it already, but we're basically describing what happened in Germany in World War II. The German people decided that it was okay to put Hitler in, knowing full well what he was going to try and do to the Jewish people. You know, it kind of falls apart when you look at it like that, doesn't it? You see, if it's just by popular vote or by popular agreement, if that's where morality really comes from, if we decide morality subjectively for ourselves, then that means that everyone's individual opinion about the nature of morality and the tenets of morality are equal. They're even. My opinion as to what is right and wrong is no more valuable or less valuable than your opinion as to what is right and what is wrong. But I think we know better than that. I think deep down we know better than that. I think we know that murder is always wrong, regardless of who you are and why you're doing it. That there are no good reasons to murder someone. And I think we can say that that is wrong objectively. But if it's wrong objectively, by itself, without my opinion, without anything that I'm saying to make it wrong, we have to ask the question, why is it wrong? Okay, so you might be asking yourself, Jared, are you saying that you can't be good without God? No, I'm not saying that at all. You don't have to believe in God to do something good or bad. You can do whatever you choose to do. If you see a cat up a tree and you don't believe in God, you can feel a moral pressure to help that cat out of the tree. Or you can give to charity, volunteer at a soup kitchen. Do whatever you need to do that you feel like you should do. But that's my point, is that statement, that feeling. I should do this. I ought to do this. Why? Because it would be wrong not to. Or because it would be right to do so. Where does that come from? You know, plenty of atheists have felt this pressure. We mentioned at the beginning Bertrand Russell, who was the poster boy, again, of atheism for his generation. And even Bertrand Russell, who wrote a whole book, several books, about how he doesn't believe in God. Even he himself in his own personal diaries wrote, "My whole religion is this, Do every duty and expect no reward for it, either here or hereafter. Do every duty. That word I find very interesting. I find it amazing. What does duty mean? Well, again, it means that I have a duty, an obligation, a pressure on me to perform a certain action. I see a little old lady with a flat tire waiting for somebody to come along and help her change it. Now I feel this pressure behind me saying, you should go over there and help her because she can't help herself. I'm not saying that that's the voice of God behind you telling you to do that. But I do have to ask the question, where does that pressure come from? What creates that pressure in me? You know, I don't have to believe in gravity for it to keep me on the ground. I can believe it's anything. I can believe it's pixie dust. But if I believe that, I don't start floating. I stay down. But I do need to be right about what's keeping me on the ground. And I start looking into why I stay on the ground. I better throw pixie dust out of the water and start focusing on what gravity is. So where does duty come from? Okay, well, let's start trying to answer that. It has to come from something outside of myself. So let's start looking at maybe the physical laws of the universe. Things like gravity. But I don't see anything in them demanding that I do something right or wrong. In fact, when I look at nature, specifically the animal kingdom, I start seeing, well, violence and blood and a lot of really nasty looking things. You know, even Darwin himself said it this way, that nature is red in tooth and claw. So nature doesn't really seem to be giving me that pressure. So it seems as if that pressure is beyond nature. Well, guess what we're back to? We're back to God again. I'm not saying that God exists because you can't be good without God. I'm saying that God is the only reasonable explanation to explain why you feel personally the need to be good in the first place. Okay, so what have we seen today? What have we really discovered today? Well, I think we've given 3 reasons to believe in the existence of God that are pretty good and not too hard to get under your belt. Yeah, there were some numbers and some other things that can be difficult at times, but I think it's pretty easy to understand where we're coming from in these arguments. The first thing we talked about was how the universe has a beginning. And if it has a beginning, it has to have a cause. What must that cause be? Well, I think God is the one that fits into that particular slot better than anything else. And then we talked about how this universe seems not only to have begun, but it seems to be so finely tuned so that you and I can live and thrive in it. Where does that tuning come from? Who set the standards of how everything works so pinpointedly? Well, again, I think God is the best explanation for that. But you know what? You're right. Those are cold. And I really think that last one, what's typically referred to as the moral argument for God's existence, is the real kicker. It's the one that hits home the most, at least. You know, numbers are numbers. And we can identify with them or not, but it's difficult to sometimes. But morality, right and wrong, that's something you and I encounter every day. And I think it makes sense to say that God is the reason for that morality. Look, Nietzsche was right. You take out God, you take out something important. He called it in his parable of the madman, wiping away the horizon. Well, what's the horizon? It's that straight line in the distance, that flat, horizontal line in the distance that tells you where you're standing is level. God is that standard. And Nietzsche recognized that. But he said that that standard can't be there because we have killed God. We have taken God out of our society. And when we do that, when we take the horizon away, everything else is going to be affected by that. Our morality, our ethics, our standards. And he was right. Again, Christians shouldn't look at what Nietzsche said and hear him saying, "Yay, God is dead. Isn't it great that we killed him?" He's very, concerned about that. In fact, he predicted that the 20th century would be horrifically bloody, and guess what? It was. Now, his answer, again, was to put a new horizon in its place. We can't put God there because God's dead, and there's no coming back from that. But maybe we can draw a new flat line. And my question is, what line could that be? What standard could replace the presence of God in our morality? And my conclusion is, nothing else fits the bill. Only God can draw those standards, can make that flat horizon. So in a sense, I think a reasonable human being is forced to believe in the existence of God. It makes the most sense. You see, typically Christians and theists are looked at as ignorant, as being just some superstitious, mumbo-jumbo believing crazy person. But at the end of the day, I think all of the data, all of the logic points to God being real. But you know what we haven't done yet? We've only shown that God has to be there. Because nothing works without His place in the equation. But again, that's not a personal God. That's just a value that we're talking about. If there is a God, if He has to be out there, what is He like? And whose God is it? Is it Cthulhu or is it somebody else? That's what we're going to be talking about starting in our next video here in our Christianity 101 series. We here at Apologetics Underground hope you have found this video informative and engaging, and we hope that it starts you thinking about these things. It starts conversations. We are so thankful that you've been here with us today. God bless. See you next time.